Imagine losing your ability to remember who you are, where you came from, and the people you love. This experience can be extremely dehumanizing. And unfortunately, this is the life that schizophrenics are forced to live every single day. Now, before I dive in, I have created a layout of my presentation. I will start off with some background, then I will state my research question along with my position. I will then make my argument, and finally, I will give you what the significance of schizophrenia is. The two sources that I chose to use from the stimulus materials was the 2024 Alzheimer's Association and False Nostalgia by Johann Norberg. I will establish the importance of these articles and why I chose to use them later on. So the first question that I want to ask you is, what is schizophrenia? If I asked any one of you in this room, you would probably say that it's someone who experiences split personality disorder. But as concluded by psychologists, this is a mischaracterization. Here's an example. Most of you probably know the renowned novel, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. But what you probably don't know is that it's about a paranoid schizophrenic. This is the story about a narrator who quarrels with his sanity after he commits murder. He claims to hear the voice and the heartbeat of his victim in his floorboard. Philosophers claim that this is the story about a guilty conscience, but as I will establish later, it's actually the story of a schizophrenic. So the true definition of schizophrenia is presented by Marco Piccone and Robin Murray, psychiatry professors at King's College, as a disorder prompted by damage to the prefrontal cortex. The symptoms of schizophrenia can vary in severity, but the main symptoms are memory loss, hallucinations, and disorientation. Now, there are two distinctive types of hallucinations that can be experienced by schizophrenics, one of those being auditory and the second one being visual. The most prominent, of course, is auditory. In fact, 74% of schizophrenics suffer from auditory hallucinations. So if we look back to the Telltale Heart story, we can see that our narrator is actually experiencing auditory hallucinations, and it's not his guilty conscience reviving his victim in his floorboard. So as I mentioned previously, schizophrenia originates in the prefrontal cortex. But what does that all entail? According to the Alzheimer's Association, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for thinking, walking, and talking. So any task that requires these skills can be impossible for a schizophrenic to accomplish. Now, there are two more terms that I need to define before I move on. One of those being hallucinations, which can be defined by Chris Frith and his team of researchers as perceptions that occur in the absence of any sensory stimulation. This means that schizophrenics do not have a solid grasp on reality, so their brain creates hallucinations in order to describe the world around them. The second definition that I must give is oxidative stress, which can be defined by a professor at the University of Washington, Alex Murray, as an imbalance of the production and subsequent buildup of reactive species. This means that our brain is producing more harmful molecules than it can detoxify. My research question for this presentation was, does increased levels of oxidative stress in schizophrenic patients distort memory? After I conducted my research, I've concluded that yes, increased levels of oxidative stress do distort memory. Now let's dive right into my argument. Oxidative stress can damage a variety of things in the human brain, including lipids, protein, and DNA. These are the core components of healthy brain cells, so damage done to any of these components can lead the cells to become dysfunctional. Now, when looking at a schizophrenic brain, neuroscientists look at three sections in particular: the prefrontal cortex, the medial temporal, and the superior temporal. According to a professor at the University of California, Catherine Carlscott, schizophrenics have reduced amounts of gray matter in these three sections. Now, as I listed the things that oxidative stress can damage that leads the cells to become dysfunctional, it makes sense why schizophrenics would have these reduced amounts of gray matter in their brain, because gray matter is composed of neurons, or brain cells. Now I want to talk about the memory aspect of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia can affect different kinds of memory, including episodic memory, which is the ability to remember certain periods or episodes in time, auditory memory, which is the ability to recall information you have heard, and finally short-term memory, which is the ability to remember something over a short period of time. It is extremely important to acknowledge what kinds of memory are affected when schizophrenia is developed in order to accurately diagnose the patients. But something that is really important when it comes to diagnosing patients is the effect on the patient themselves. Psychiatrists have interviewed patients in order to get a full perspective of their disorder. One of these psychiatrists was F. Fischer, a German psychiatrist who talked to one of his patients about his conception of time, how time moves, how time feels for this patient, and his patient's response was, "Time has come to a standstill," which suggests that schizophrenics do not have a conception of time, and time is an endless loop, and they do not have the cognitive ability to escape it. So why is schizophrenia such a notable problem? Well, this answer is provided by Johan Norberg, a Swedish historian who claims that identity is composed of first-person memories. Now, as I establish what kinds of memories are affected when schizophrenia is introduced into the brain, these schizophrenics do not have these first-person memories to compose their identity. Norberg continues on to say that identity is what keeps us sane, so even while the world around us is constantly changing, we always have our identity to fall back on. Unfortunately, schizophrenics do not have any identity to run back to. So in conclusion, oxidative stress introduced into the brain damages the neurons in the prefrontal cortex, which consequently affects episodic, auditory, and short-term memory, which is what are the main memories that compose identity, which is what causes schizophrenics to return to a manic state and therefore worsen their disorder. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of questions for you. First, how did some preliminary information you gathered inform your research?
So originally when I was looking for a topic, I wanted to talk about schizophrenia and memory, but I wasn't really looking for what causes schizophrenia in the first place. And then I came across an article that talked about oxidative stress. And I didn't really know what that was preliminary, so I had to go and do further research. So a lot of my research was composed of definitions and terminology and all of these things. So I think that I really had to learn more about my topic beforehand before I could give a presentation and therefore make my argument later on.
Okay. And what additional questions emerged from your research? Why are these questions important?
So when I was doing my research, I found things that talked about medications that can maintain schizophrenia, but I wanted to ask if there were any additional medications that could potentially cure schizophrenia. Now that neuroscientists know what causes it, is there any medication that could combat the oxidative stress and not so much the disorder is in its entirety? Because mostly when people are diagnosed with schizophrenia, they're so far along that medication cannot really help them cure it or manage it in a way that they can still do basic function. So I wanted to ask if there was any preliminary medication that we could start early once we notice oxidative stress is developing in the brain.
Okay.